Good evening. I'm Eric Beerbaum, Director of Graduate Fellowships at the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics and Associate Professor in Government and Social Studies. And it's really a pleasure tonight to introduce Professor Anna Stilz, Associate Professor of Politics at Princeton. Her research focuses on the ethics of political institutions, with a special worry about the exercise of coercive state power. She is a leading, I would say the leading, political theorist of her generation, an extraordinarily versatile scholar. Stiltz's papers include Collective Responsibility in the State, Guest Workers and Second-Class Citizenship, On Colonialism, and the Idea of the Organic State. Her book, Liberal Loyalty, Freedom, Obligation, and the State, is a rewarding, deep, and inventive contribution to the dual literatures of democratic theory and global justice. There she steers between the usual nationalist and universalist approaches to thinking what's morally valuable about citizenship. For universalists, any differences between us is a reason for you and what is a reason for me that are not attributable to our circumstances must be attributable to some general feature of us. But Stilz believes that in certain kinds of cases, something can be a reason for me and not for you because of something more general, but simply because I am a particular person who stands in a particular relation to other citizens. In so doing, she introduces an irreducibly agent-relative dimension to democratic theory, departing from available universalist views. So she'll be previewing part of her second book here tonight, taking up the problem of territory, which is kind of a third rail in political theory. She herself admits elsewhere that the problem looks impossible to solve. Her theory of occupancy rights is, I think, more needed today than ever with mass migration of refugees and other displaced populations. We should have known this, that Stiltz's penchant for seemingly intractable problems when she was a graduate fellow here at the center, not so long ago. She was known for the forcefulness and tenacity of her questioning. She often sat out in the very crowd you're sitting now, speakers not expecting what they were going to get with her questions. I suppose we owe her the honor tonight of that similar forcefulness and tenacity, and inasmuch we can muster. Like others here, I've personally been at the receiving end of this questioning, and there really isn't a political theorist, junior or senior, who's been more subjected in my own work to sharper criticism at, unfortunately, sometimes public events. Stilz is a philosopher's political theorist, and her need to unpack a muddled thought, even if she needs to walk her discussant far down the garden path. I should say that when we invited Stilz, it was the first time, I believe, the center had invited a junior faculty member to give this kind of public lecture, and I actually think that the poster reflects the title assistant professor, but I'm pleased to announce that she's now been wisely tenured by Princeton. So we're really grateful to have her return to Harvard, so it's only appropriate that she offered us the title Territory, Expulsion, and the Right of Return. She's earned that right of return.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's wonderful to be back, and I have such fond memories of being a grad fellow at the Safra Center, so it's really excellent to have the opportunity to return. Okay, I'm going to start out my talk with a case, the case of the Navajo removal. In 1864, the United States Army removed 10,000 Navajo Indians from their homeland in Arizona to a reservation in what's now the state of New Mexico. And 200 people died on this overland trek to the New Mexico reservation, which the Navajos actually still refer to in their kind of national history as their quote-unquote long walk. This removal was not a success, so during their time at the new reservation, the Navajos became dispirited, and they suffered from hunger, drought, and disease. And in 1868, the U.S. actually allowed the survivors to return back to their lands in Arizona, which was very unusual. It's actually the only instance of this among the tribes it relocated during the War for the West. So I think the moral issues that are raised by this Navajo case are fairly typical of territorial expulsions, including the expulsions of Germans from Poland and Czechoslovakia after World War II, the expulsion of Palestinians at the moment of Israel's creation, and the removals of indigenous peoples in Africa and Australia. So I need to apologize. I have a little bit of a cold, so you may have to bear with me. But I want to spend my talk today addressing two issues that these expulsion cases raise. So the first issue is, how exactly should we conceive of the right that is violated by a territorial removal? So I think we tend to think that these removals are wrong because the people who live in a place like the Navajos, have a right to be where they are. But what exactly gives people the right to occupy a particular geographical space? And I'm going to refer to the kind of right in question, this right to permanently reside in a place, as an occupancy right. So my first question is, what exactly grounds occupancy rights? And then the second question I want to address is, what corrective measures are appropriate when a wrongful expulsion has occurred in the past? So when people are wrongly removed from their territory, should we take steps to undo the effects of this expulsion? And if so, what should those steps be? And does the case for correcting expulsion, does it retain its force indefinitely, or is it somehow time limited? Okay, so since territorial occupancy is not really a familiar concept, I want to start by saying something more about it. And to kind of capture the claim that I have in mind, I want us to consider 3 different property-like entitlements that could apply to roughly the same sort of GPS location. So first, there's fairly familiar rights of private ownership, like my right over my house. So my property right in my house encompasses a whole bundle of particular incidents, like the claim to sell it, the claim to rent it and derive the income, the claim to exclude other people from it, and so on. And there's also familiar rights of territorial jurisdiction. So both the United States and the state of New Jersey claim the right to make and enforce law in the area where my house is. And that includes the power to change my property rights over my house by, say, modifying zoning laws, or by exercising the power of eminent domain and taking my house with compensation. Yet neither of those 2 claims, I think, actually captures the right that was violated by the Navajo removal. So the Navajos, at the time of their removal, did not form a state with a defined territory and a mature legal system. So removal did not violate their territorial jurisdiction. And though the Navajos recognized some private property rights, like rights over their livestock and their dwellings, those rights were very limited, and they did not extend to property and land. Yet it seems that even a Navajo who owned no private property was still wronged by the removal. So I don't think that private property and territorial jurisdiction actually exhaust our rights over geographical space. Instead, I think that individuals also have a third kind of property-like entitlement to space, and that's what I'm calling an occupancy right. And that's the right to reside permanently in a particular place, to participate in the social, cultural, and economic practices that are ongoing there, and to be immune from expropriation or removal by others. So even non-property owners, like children or homeless people, can still possess occupancy rights. And even people who lack any organized legal institutions, like non-state tribes, can also have occupancy rights. And that's why actions like removal and expulsion are wrong. So as I understand an occupancy right, it comprises 2 main elements. So first, the liberty to reside permanently in a particular place and to make use of that area for social, cultural, and economic practices. And I think that this extends to the liberty to travel freely through the area in order to access the places in civil society where those practices occur. So I'm not conceiving occupancy rights as conferring the liberty of access to other people's private property. But I think it does confer access to public spaces, spaces like parks, roads, byways, as well as businesses or buildings that offer services to the general public, whether those are publicly or privately owned. And the second element I think that's comprised in an occupancy right is a claim right against other people, not to remove one from that area, and not to interfere with one's use of the space in ways that undermine the shared social practices in which one's engaged. Okay, so I think we can think of these occupancy rights as limited claims to property in the Earth's surface, as long as we're clear that the nature of these claims differs greatly from rights of private ownership. So an occupancy right is not an exclusive right. Many people can share occupancy in the same place. And it does not confirm many of the incidents that we associate with private property, like rights to income, say, from the natural resources on the territory, or rights to give or sell or bequeath the territory. So occupancy, as I conceive it, is primarily a right of secure use and access to a particular space. So the right to use a place as a permanent residence, to conduct important social, cultural, and economic activities there, including accessing the places where those activities unfold, and to be immune from expropriation by others. Now, like private ownership rights, occupancy rights, as I understand them, are held by individuals, the residents of a particular place, while rights of territorial jurisdiction, for example, are collective rights that are held by states or other political organizations. So I think we need to understand occupancy not as a conventional property right that is conferred by social practices, say, or systems of law, but rather as a pre-institutional moral right. And to see why I think that, I want us to consider a case where people who do not share any legal system or any kind of background practices about property or common rules about property come into contact with one another for the first time. So a good case of this, I think, is Christopher Columbus sailing up to the New World in 1492. So I think, and I think most of you would agree, that Columbus had a moral duty to respect the native inhabitants' occupancy of their land, even though he shared no background legal institutions or property conventions with the people he encountered. So it was not morally permissible for him to displace the natives and take the island for himself and his sailors. And that kind of thought experiment, I think, shows that this moral duty to respect occupancy does not depend on the existence of background property conventions that are generally recognized by a given population or on a state's system of property law. Now, I don't here mean to endorse the sort of broader thesis that all forms of property are similarly pre-institutional. It seems very reasonable to me to think that there are many kinds of property, like rights to alienate and inherit, that do depend on background law and convention in a particular society. All I'm committed to saying is that there are at least some limited kinds of property that could obtain outside shared social institutions, and that territorial occupancy is one of those. Okay, so how might we justify such a pre-institutional moral right of occupancy? Why do we have these occupancy rights, and what grounds them? So I believe occupancy of a particular place is of central importance for an individual's life plans and projects. And what's most striking to me about the Navajo removal case that I started with is that it severely disrupted the Navajos' ability to enjoy the lives that they had built for themselves in Arizona. And because people have an interest in pursuing the projects and relationships that are central to their lives, I think they also have an interest in the background conditions that are necessary to carry them out, one of which, I think, is stable territorial occupancy. So to kind of see what I have in mind, note that most of our complex goals and relationships require us to form expectations about the continued use of and secure access to a permanent place of residence. So geography and climate can affect the economic and subsistence practices that we take up, making it difficult for us to reconstitute those in some very different place. So suppose you run a dairy farm, an economic practice that structures much of your life. You couldn't continue to pursue that practice if you were moved, say, to Siberia or to the American Southwest. Our religious, cultural, and recreational activities also often have territorial components. We might think of how sled dog racing, for example, belongs in the Arctic, and surfing in coastal areas, or of how religions sometimes incorporate specific places or natural formations into their rituals of observance. And finally, people form personal bonds and enter work, religious, and friendship relations, in part because they expect to remain spatially arranged in certain ways. So we structure our daily activities and associate together under the assumption that current patterns of residence will not be massively disrupted. And I want to call these situated goals, relationships, and pursuits our located life plans. Okay, so we can separate out kind of several significant categories of located life plans. I'm not claiming that these are all the categories there are, but they're salient ones. So first, we might think of economic practices. So many economic practices can only be carried on a territory with certain geological, ecological, or infrastructural characteristics. So the Sioux Indians' economy was based on hunting wild buffalo, which meant that they had an interest in living somewhere that could sustain those animals. Many modern Americans work in white-collar professional jobs, so they have an interest in living where there's office space, internet access, and so on. A second kind of category is membership in religious, social, cultural, and educational organizations. So many located life plans require individuals to have access to spaces that are shared with other people. For a person to have the option to pursue a religious, recreational, educational, or work activity means being able to access the physical spaces and infrastructure, things like churches, mosques, schools, meeting houses, and so on, where those kinds of activities occur. A third category is personal relationships. So people are engaged in networks of relationships with colleagues, family, and friends that are very fundamental to their well-being. They have an interest in continuing those relationships with the particular people that matter to them, and that requires living near enough to do so. It's also very difficult to draw boundaries around self-contained communities, such that one could move all and only that group without breaking anyone's personal ties, because people are tied to very differing networks of associates and friends. So sustaining people's important personal relationships will often require maintaining their current spatial arrangements to a significant degree. And the fourth category I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, attachment to locality. So some, though not all people, have fundamental projects that are based on a special identification with a unique locality. So for example, the Taos Pueblo's religious rituals center on this particular lake called Blue Lake in New Mexico. The Sioux attribute spiritual significance to the Black Hills. The Highland culture of Switzerland is focused specifically on the Alps. Okay, so taken together, I think those reflections show that the people who live on a territory have important plan-based interests in continuing to occupy that place and in using it for the located social, cultural, and economic practices that they value. And we might think of those as kind of well-being interests. And along with those well-being interests in our particular territory, I think we also have a related autonomy interest in being the person in charge of kind of controlling and revising the fundamental commitments that are central to the structure of our lives. So obviously our located life plans must take account of other people's legitimate needs and interests, and that will sometimes mean that we need to revise them in ways we might not otherwise choose to do. But I think we still have a key interest in exercising a significant degree of personal control over the goals and commitments that comprehensively structure our lives. And when other people interfere with or prevent us from pursuing very fundamental goals, goals like working in our chosen occupation, practicing our religion, forming intimate friendships and family relationships, this jeopardizes our kind of sense of authorship over our own life. And one form that kind of interference can take is expulsion from our territory. So I want to stress that my located life plans account attributes occupancy rights in the first instance to the individual residents of a place, and only derivatively to the cultural and other groups in which they participate. And here I differ from, there are some other theorists of territorial rights kind of out there who would attribute this right, this occupancy right, to a corporate nation, say, defined in cultural terms. And so I want to stress that I attribute this right to individuals. So on my view, each person requires access to the shared spaces on which her located life plans depend, but people who actually live in very close proximity to one another can have interests in very different spaces and participate in totally different practices. So for example, a Cuban immigrant may have an interest in living in Miami because it contains his family, his workplace, his Catholic church, and his fellow Spanish speakers, while a Jewish Miamian may have an occupancy interest in the same area because it contains his soccer club, his synagogue, and his school. So there's no overlap between the practices in which those two people participate, but each one has an interest in living in Miami because it contains shared spaces that are fundamental to him. Okay, so showing that people have an interest in the area that's fundamental to their located life plans is sort of a good first step in an argument that they have a right to occupy that area. But we also have to assess whether their interest is sufficiently weighty to justify imposing a duty on others to respect it, because duties carry costs. And if other people have important conflicting or countervailing interests in not bearing those costs, then that might defeat the case for a right. So in most cases, I actually have difficulty conceiving of a weighty countervailing interest in being able to remove or expel others from their territory or to interfere with their occupancy in ways that undermine their shared social practices. Nor, again, in most cases, does compliance with duties to respect others' occupancy seem especially burdensome. So as long as an outsider enjoys flourishing located life plans where she lives, depriving her of the liberty to interfere with others' use of territory isn't unduly costly to her. But there is one class of cases, I think, where imposing duties to respect occupancy is quite burdensome. If someone does not enjoy flourishing located life plans where that person now is, then he has a significant interest in acquiring some geographical space in which to pursue those plans, even if that space is currently occupied by other people. And that suggests to me that we need to add what I call an equitable distribution constraint to our general account of territorial occupancy. So in occupying a territory, one must leave others with access to enough space to secure their parallel interest in located life plans. So it would be great if I could give you a full theory of those distributional constraints, and unfortunately I can't yet, hopefully. Eventually I will. And that's because deciding which of the many candidate distributional principles that are out there on offer, sufficiency, equal per capita shares, priority, the difference principle, deciding which of those should apply to this distinctive good, territorial occupancy, I think is a very thorny and complicated question. But I am going to say one thing about this, and that's that I believe that we can say with confidence that everyone's enjoyment of sufficient territory for a decent life is a plausible minimal requirement for the equitable distribution of space. So any good theory of occupancy is going to have to allow for at least this. So I'm just going to talk about sufficiency really to illustrate the role that the equitable distribution constraint plays in my view. And I assume that if it turns out that some more demanding distributive principle is the right one, like equal per capita shares, then my view can be revised accordingly. So on a sufficiency view, we will need to require that everyone has access to a geographical space that allows him opportunity for adequate flourishing. And we might highlight two kinds of resources, natural resources on the one hand, and social resources on the other hand, that serve to make a territory adequate in this way. So people must enjoy natural resources that are sufficient for their subsistence and flourishing, including food, shelter, and a livable environment. And people must enjoy adequate social institutions for flourishing, so institutions that guarantee at least their basic security and protect their most essential interests in forming and pursuing life plans by allowing them to practice their religion and culture and associate together with others, including being free to form intimate friendships and family relationships. So on this sufficiency approach, if outsiders lack access to these minimal natural and social resources, then current occupants are going to be obliged to share their territory with them or to provide them with those resources in some other way. Okay, so as long as the equitable distribution constraint is met, however, I think that our interest in stable located life plans is significant enough to justify imposing duties on others not to remove us from our territory and not to interfere with our use of it in ways that undermine our shared social, cultural, and economic practices. And that's really for two reasons. First, the increased security that's afforded to located life plans by recognizing those kinds of duties is of great benefit to us. And second, our interest in not having those duties imposed on us, I think, is quite weak by comparison. Okay, so now I want to talk about three objections that people have posed to my argument that connects this idea of territorial occupancy to this interest in stable located life plans. So the first objection I'm going to call the translocation objection. So the idea is that, well, perhaps our social practices could theoretically be translocated to some other location without any disruption. So maybe Princeton University, where I work, could be kind of taken out of New Jersey and reconstructed brick by brick in Madagascar. And all the people could be resettled in exactly their current patterns of residence. So we had a kind of Potemkin Princeton in a new location. So would there then be any harm in relocating people? So I haven't been very moved by this objection, and I want to give three reasons. So first, I doubt that it's possible to realistically move people without disruption. So moving people generally involves detaching them from their workplace and cultural associations, and they have to reconstitute those things in a new place, which generally involves a difficult period of adjustment for them. Second, I think this objection trades on this idea that we could draw boundaries around self-contained communities. such that we could kind of take this group of people and move them without breaking any relationships and social ties. But I think that's a false view of our social world because people are tied to very different kinds of networks and associations. And third, since all places on Earth, save maybe Antarctica, are currently inhabited, it's difficult for me to see where we could put people that wouldn't involve transforming their life plans, simply in virtue of the fact that a different social world already exists there. So, I mean, I think this translocation objection shows us something. It shows that the connection between our life plans and our interest in territorial occupancy is not a kind of a priori logical connection, it's an empirical connection. But I think that this empirical connection is quite robust. Okay, so my second objection I'm going to call the loner. And this objection says, well, perhaps the stability of located life plans, it's not really fundamental to each and every person's well-being, right? So you might be thinking of these indigenous peoples and stuff, but some people have only very generic located life plans, right? Say somebody who lives in a cookie-cutter suburb, telecommutes, and all they really need is an internet connection in order to feel at home. So since there's kind of a plurality of modern, suburban, English-speaking social settings out there, why does it matter to the loner which one he inhabits? Okay, so I think that conclusion might be true for the loner, but I don't think that it shows that the stability of located life plans doesn't matter for modern people generally, and I don't think it undermines my argument for occupancy rights. So a peculiar feature of the loner is that he has no social or associational ties, no friends, no family, no workplace connections, no membership in any religious or cultural organizations. Now, some people might be as socially disconnected as the loner, but clearly most people are not, and it's not reasonable to expect them to be. But we generally think that rights are grounded in broadly shareable fundamental interests that feature in a wide variety of plans of life. And that means that the idiosyncrasies of the loner do not affect the case that territorially stable access to social relationships and practices is a necessary background condition for a wide variety of plans of life. So even this loner should enjoy the background conditions for forming stable social ties should he revise his plans and decide to do so. So just as there are some people who never join any associations, they never, join a church or any kind of group, they still should enjoy the right to freedom of association should they revise their life plans and decide to join one. I think we can say the very same thing about the loner. Okay, so my last objection is that, well, maybe what's wrong with the Navajo removal is just that it features coercion, right? People were forced to move at the barrel of a gun, right? So why are you going on about this fact that they violated some kind of limited property right in the earth? Okay. So we often think that it's pro tanto wrong to coerce people to do things. And one story we might tell about that is it's wrong because it subjects their will and their power to decide what they're going to do to the will of the coercer. Now, I don't want to deny that the Navajo removal was wrong in part because it did feature coercion. But I do deny that coercion captures all that was problematic about it. Now, usually when people are removed from their territory, they are indeed evicted by force. But there are some cases of what I'm going to call uncoerced removal. And I think that an uncoerced removal is almost as wrong as its more forcible variant. So for such a case, I want us to consider the birth of the Palestinian refugee situation in 1948. So the exodus of Palestinians occurred in stages. And in the first stage, many Palestinians actually fled to nearby countries voluntarily. So they weren't thinking in terms of permanently immigrating abroad, right? They were just in an uncertain scenario, and so they intended to evacuate the area temporarily and then return to their homes once the war was over. Now later on, many Palestinians were forcibly evicted by the Jewish army. But I think all of these Palestinians were equally deprived of their occupancy rights because Israel decided not to allow them to return to their homes once the war was over. And that decision effectively destroyed the lives that they had built for themselves in Palestine and made them into refugees in the surrounding countries. Now, one might object that since you have to use force at the border to prevent people from returning, this example isn't proving my intended point, that there's more at stake in removal than compulsion, but I think it does show this. So Palestinians were forcibly prevented from returning to their homes. And that's a very different thing from being subjected to coercion at the border of Japan or Sweden or some third-party country. And I don't think we can understand this distinctiveness of being prevented from returning to your home unless we suggest that there's something more at stake here in removal than coercion. So I think that though coercion does often feature in territorial removal, it doesn't fully account for its wrongness. Removal is wrong not just because it's coercive, but also because it dispossesses people of a place where they have a right to live. Okay, so to sum up this kind of plan-based account of occupancy in a sort of formal-ish statement, I think we can say that a person has a pre-institutional right to occupy a particular area if, first, he resides there now, or he's previously done so. Second, if access to shared spaces in that area is fundamental to his located life plans. And third, if his connection to that territory was established without any wrongdoing on his part, involving at a minimum no expulsion of prior occupants or infringement of others' claims to an equitable distribution of geographical space. Okay, so that account includes a no expulsion requirement, and I now want to think about that in some more detail. So an important tool of colonial expansion in modern times has been the settlement of previously inhabited lands, as occurred in the US, in Australia, or in Israel. So what should these states and their citizens do about the wrongful territorial expulsions in their past? Should they take steps to undo the effects of these past wrongs, and if so, what should those steps be? So I want to highlight, or I want to make a caveat before kind of saying more, which is that usually more than one kind of claim is violated in settlement projects. So often people's private property is confiscated, often countries that were formerly independent were colonized or annexed. And those are violations of the claims of private ownership and territorial jurisdiction that I mentioned earlier. So full corrective justice for kind of settler colonialism might require a multi-pronged approach involving a number of different measures, including restitution of stolen property, compensation, or rights of self-determination for wrongly colonized territories. And I'm not going to give you a full theory of that kind today. Here, I just want to focus on the violation of occupancy rights and the remedial measures that are appropriate to that. Okay, so let's consider two fairly radical remedies. So the first I'm going to call repatriation. And that imposes a remedial duty on settlers who have violated other people's occupancy rights to withdraw and to return to permanent residence in their territory of origin. The second remedy is the right of return, which is often demanded by exiled populations, including contemporary Palestinians. So return is a remedial right of those who have been expelled or their descendants to regain residency in their prior territory. And there are also other measures that we might take to remedy violations of occupancy in lieu of repatriation and return. So for example, we could pay compensation to expelled victims for harms that they suffered, or we could aid them in settling in some new place. Okay, so which of those measures, if any, is appropriate to violations of occupancy? And do those remedies retain their force indefinitely, or are they time limited? If we have to go back and undo all the wrongful expulsions and dispossessions that have ever happened in the past, then many present-day people are going to be displaced from their locations, and some people could be left without anywhere to live. Okay. So I think that any plausible theory of occupancy will at least ground a presumption of repatriation and return in first-generation cases. And by that I mean that living wrongdoers who unjustly expelled people from their territory are generally going to be required to restore the territory to the living victims that they expelled. So to illustrate what I have in mind, I want us to consider another famous Indian removal case. In 1838, US troops removed the Cherokees from their homeland in Georgia and relocated them to Indian Territory, which is in what is now Oklahoma. So in this case, though, unlike the Navajo case, Cherokee lands were pretty much immediately reallocated to white settlers, each of whom had kind of signed up for a land lottery that was held by the state of Georgia. Now, suppose it's 1839, so it's a year after the Cherokee removal, and some of those white settlers have now built homes and established businesses in the area. Do those people have occupancy rights there? It seems clear to me that they do not, since they are wrongly displacing the Cherokees. Instead, they're under a duty to restore the land to their expelled victims. So why are they under that duty? Well, most first-generation settlers chose to engage in an activity that they knew or should have reasonably foreseen would wrongly displace innocent people. And by voluntarily contributing to the dispossession of the Cherokees, doing things like agitating for their removal, buying tickets in the land lottery, building homes on land that they knew to be wrongly taken, those settlers forfeited any right to establish located life plans in the area. And any plausible theory of occupancy, I think, is going to have to make occupancy rights sensitive to those kinds of considerations about people's personal responsibility for wrongful violations. It would be perverse and also radically unfair to hold that simply by expelling a victim and forcing her to reorder her whole life, a wrongdoer could then acquire rights over her territory. So for those reasons, I think people who engage in wrongful expulsions forfeit their rights to establish located life plans in the new location, and they're under a duty to restore the territory to the original inhabitants. Okay, do those first-generation victims, do they have a right to come back? I think they do have a right to come back if they choose to do so, and I want to offer two reasons for that. So first, the victim's return often enables them to reconstitute their located life plans, which are very important to their personal well-being. So if they can return to their economic practices and reclaim their homes and their associational and cultural infrastructure, those victims have a right to do so. But second, as I mentioned earlier, people not only have this well-being interest in the located life plans that they have, they also have an additional interest, an autonomy interest, in being the agent in control of any changes or revisions to their life plans, rather than in having them revised or manipulated against their will by outside forces. And that second interest, I think, is important in justifying a right to return, even in cases where victims' located life plans can't easily be reconstituted. So suppose, as actually often happens in these cases, the wrongful settlers destroy the victims' homes and all their economic and associational infrastructure, so that basically all the non-geographical features that once connected them to that particular place are now they're just gone. So intuitively, it seems to me that those victims still have a claim to return, even though if they did return, they'd have to rebuild their lives from scratch in just the way that they would if they were to go to some new location. So why is this so? I think they have this claim because the victims do not just have an interest in continuing the life plans that they currently have, this well-being interest, but also an interest in being the one in charge of changing and revising them if such revision should occur, this autonomy interest. And that's an interest in authorship over your own life. So it's one thing if I decide tomorrow to leave my friends and my family and my job and move to Australia and radically transform the entire structure of my life. But it's a very different thing if tomorrow someone decides to have me moved to Australia, whether I like it or not. And this interest in controlling revisions or changes to your plans, I think, grounds what I want to call a disjunctive right. So for victims to either go back if they wish, or to waive their right of return and to accept compensation and aid for building a new life somewhere else. So even if their life plans have been changed by forces beyond their control, I think giving them this disjunctive right allows it to be their decision whether or not to accept the change. And that mitigates the effect of an alien transformation of their lives and restores to them a degree of self-authorship. And so for that reason, I think the first-generation victims are generally going to have a right to return if they choose to do so. Okay, so even in relatively recent cases of settlement, there are often serious complications to this basic, fairly straightforward picture I've just painted. So some settlers have excuses or even justifications for what they did. So the Cherokee case is a particularly clear one, but while those Georgia settlers freely signed up for the land lottery, duress was involved in many other cases, as for example when Britain transported all its convicts to Australia. Or we might think of the often impoverished and even illiterate indentured servants who got on a boat to come over to pre-revolutionary America. So those people might have been totally ignorant of the injustice of the processes in which they participated. And some cases of settlement may have been justified on grounds of necessity, as with Jews fleeing Nazi persecution in the 1930s and 40s and settling in Palestine. So those people lacked any territory in which to form and pursue their own located life plans, and they may have had a claim to procure some space in which to live secure and flourishing lives. So I think those I want to say, first of all, that I do think that these complications deserve greater theorizing than I'm going to be able to give them today. But I believe that although these considerations show that some settlers should not be blamed for their participation in the colonization process, and even that some settlers may have had legitimate occupancy rights in the new place, especially if they were refugees who had no home to return to, I don't think that these complications really undermine our presumption in favor of first-generation remedies. So even where duress or ignorance was involved, I think that excused settlers are still under a duty to repatriate if they're able to do so at reasonable cost to themselves. So they're wronging others by retaining their lands, and though they're not blameworthy for getting involved in the process, they can still be held liable to correct the wrong to the victims. And in cases where first-generation settlers really have nowhere else to go, they may not be obliged to repatriate, but I don't think that undermines a right of return on the part of the expelled victims. So it's not justified to destroy the lives of the original occupants of a territory, even in order to rescue yourself from a desperate plight. And I also don't think it's necessary, because most territories can accommodate additional residents without expelling the old ones. So generally then, a group of justified settlers, I think, should expect to share territory with the original occupants and not to expel them. And if they instead engaged in a removal, then they have a special responsibility to facilitate their victims' return and to compensate them for any harms those victims had to endure. Now, I realize sometimes this kind of sharing of territory is going to involve two groups of people, the expelled victims, say, and the justified settlers, who wish to use the resources on the territory in potentially incompatible ways. And in cases like this, I think that each side has a duty to make concessions in their way of life in order to allow the other side to enjoy at least core elements of their social and cultural practices. And that may mean accepting a resource use framework that involves some transformation of each side's demands in order to allow everyone to preserve at least the most fundamental of their located life plans. But the important point I want to stress here, though, is that I think the located life plans account can ground a presumption in favor of repatriation and return in the first generation. But this corrective principle, the one I've just argued for, it's going to apply only within the lifetimes of actual wrongdoers and their actual victims. So it's not going to require, say, grandchildren of wrongdoers to make reparation to grandchildren of victims. And what I want to ask now is whether this limited principle of repair is all we need. Is that completely sufficient? Or do we need to go beyond it? So can first generation repatriation and return support our full range of intuitive judgments about settlement and expulsion? Okay. So in many cases, I think that this limited principle is going to be enough. So often the descendants of an expelled group do not plausibly inherit their parents' claim to return. So consider Jews who were expelled from Eastern Europe 2 generations ago, but whose children grew up in America or in Israel, or the children of Germans who were expelled from Poland but have grown up in Germany. It doesn't seem to me that these people have any outstanding claim to return to their grandparents' ancestral homes. Now, I'm not saying they have no claims at all. I agree that in these cases, other remedies may still be due to them. So for example, if property was expropriated from their parents, they may be owed compensation for that, or they may be owed an apology and an acknowledgement of the past injustice. But return and repatriation do not seem appropriate here, because the descendants' interest in territorial occupancy is not suffering a continued setback in the present. So they have occupancy rights and perfectly flourishing life projects in the places where they now reside. Okay, so this shows, I think, that, or it kind of illustrates a feature of the located life plans approach, which is that occupancy rights are not inherited. So occupancy rights may be sort of contingently transmitted to the next generation if descendants form located life plans in the same area that their parents did. But where no such connection exists, descendants will not necessarily inherit rights to occupy their ancestral territory. So instead, the bearers of occupancy rights in a particular place can change as people's located life plans change. And I think this is just really a reflection of the fact that what justifies occupancy rights in the first place is kind of a certain class of agent relative values. It's the importance of the fundamental goals and pursuits that structure people's lives and to which they're committed. So my occupation as a dairy farmer, or my religious practices as a member of the Sioux people, or my attachments to my own friends and associates might give me a special claim to the territorial stability of those practices. But other people who don't really have those attachments and commitments do not have the same claims that I do. And so for that reason, descendants whose lives are very different from their ancestors will not necessarily stand in the same special relationship to their ancestors' lands, because those lands may not play the same essential role in the goals and practices to which they're currently committed. Still, though, I think that the located life plans account should allow for at least some cases where rights of return do persist beyond the first generation. And I really think that such claims are going to exist only where the descendants of expelled victims lack the kinds of flourishing located life plans we think they ought to have. And especially worrying to me anyway, are sort of first cases where descendants remain refugees or second-class citizens who have really failed to establish flourishing located life plans in their new residence. Or second, cases where descendants lack lands that are quite fundamental to their ongoing religious and cultural projects. So consider Palestinians who are living today in refugee camps in Lebanon. So these people live often without potable water and basic infrastructure. They face employment restrictions that bar them from many occupations. They're unable to own or inherit property, and they cannot petition for Lebanese citizenship. So they are still suffering in ways that are causally connected to the expulsion of their ancestors in 1948. And intuitively, I think we are concerned about their situation in a way we're not in the case of a German whose grandparents were exiled from Poland. So return seems like potentially an appropriate remedy here. So in these cases, I believe that though the wrong to their ancestors occurred long ago, we can say that the victims' descendants continue to be harmed by that wrong, and that therefore they have an ongoing claim of redress. And moreover, I think we can also say that the settler state bears a continued special responsibility for their suffering. So after all, it expelled their ancestors in the first place, and so for that reason, the settler state ought to be first in line when it comes to addressing their situation today. So it seems clear that Israel's past expulsion causally contributes to the bad present-day condition of many second and third generation Palestinians. The fact that they were born in refugee camps is due to Israel's decision not to allow their forefathers to return to their homes. There's a philosophical kind of conundrum in understanding how we can say that people kind of continue to be harmed by a past event. And there's a lot of literature on the metaphysics of harm that goes into some quite complicated issues. But I think we can understand our intuitive concern about the Palestinians' situation, I believe, if we adopt a definition of harm that holds that a person is harmed by an action if that action causes him to be in an absolutely bad situation, like a state of pain, disability, or significant personal hardship, as judged in non-comparative terms. And if we adopt that approach to understanding harm, then we sort of avoid some of the conundrums that are involved with thinking about harm from past events. Because we don't need to know exactly what overall level of well-being the Palestinian descendants might have somehow enjoyed if their ancestors had never been expelled. All we need to know is that they are currently in a normatively unacceptable condition, and that the past expulsion causally contributes to that condition, namely their lack of a territory of permanent residence. So on that approach, I think we can define continued harm by reference to a normatively significant threshold. So harm occurs when people fall below a certain level of basic rights and resources that they're owed as the result of someone else's past act. And it also seems likely that the state of Israel bears a continuing special responsibility to repair this harm. So Israel is a persisting transgenerational organization that can be held responsible for the past harms it inflicted. And states treat themselves as holistically responsible in this way all of the time. They sign treaties that are binding on them in perpetuity, and they contract public debts that future generations of their citizens will have to repay. International law also holds that when a state commits an internationally wrongful act, it has a duty to make reparation for any injury it causes by restitution, compensation, or some alternative form of satisfaction. And this responsibility in international law is attributed to the state itself, which is viewed as a collective agent that can be held responsible independently of its members. So just as states have a duty to pay their public debts and to keep their treaties, I think we can also hold them responsible to repair the situation of victims that they've wronged, including the descendants of people they expelled if those descendants continue to suffer from the effects of the harm. Okay. So suppose this very rough sketch for extending some claims beyond the first generation succeeds. What particular policies might be appropriate for these second and third generation kinds of cases? To repair the harm to contemporary Palestinians, must Israel allow them to return to the homes of their ancestors? Or could it compensate them in some other way, perhaps by aiding their resettlement somewhere else? So I think the case for a right of return to a particular place is much weaker for second or third generation descendants than it is for expelled victims. And alternative remedies may therefore be more appropriate here. So in my view, these Palestinian descendants are suffering primarily because they lack a permanent territorial residence of any kind, and not because they lack Palestine. But it's not clear that this more general claim gives them the right to return to the homes of their ancestors in particular, because it's not clear that they bear the right sort of life projects and attachments to that particular place as their ancestors did. Now, there's a pretty obvious objection that one might make here. So even though individual Palestinians might lack these lived connections with the homeland of their ancestors, the Palestinians are a nation, and a nation preserves an attachment to its ancient homeland for a long time, longer than 3 generations and maybe even forever. But I really doubt that an identification with a territory that's grounded purely in national narrative, rather than in people's lived experiences, can ground an entitlement to reoccupy that territory. That's particularly true, I think, where a group has built a flourishing cultural and political life in some other place. The claim that a nation kind of centers its whole existence around a place has to be reasonably verifiable. And if they enjoy a robust cultural and political existence somewhere else, then that claim is falsified. So a good example of this, I think, is that when you think about the Serbs, they are very strongly identified with Kosovo because a very important battle in their national history took place on the territory in the 14th century. But their claim to reoccupy that territory is not credible, given the fact that most of their political and cultural practices now take place in Serbia. So for most Palestinian descendants, too, their sense of attachment to actual places in Israel is not based on a real experience or interaction with these places, but rather on a national narrative that was constructed long after displacement. So the homes and villages of their ancestors either no longer exist, or they've been transformed really beyond all recognition. And their former economic pursuits are no longer practicable there. So what is left is a set of narratives and myths that often have very little to do with the reality of the particular places being imagined. I want to note one important caveat here. I think in many cases the particularity of a claim of return becomes diluted by the third generation. So it's not clear that these descendants are really connected to the homes of their ancestors. But there are a few cases, I think, where descendants of expelled victims have actual ongoing attachments to their ancestral territory that are grounded in their own life projects and not in the life projects of their ancestors. And those kinds of ongoing social, cultural, and economic practices might support a greater claim to return if they are specially attached to a unique locality. So for example, sometimes a particular locality plays an important role in religious or cultural practices, and those projects are significantly impaired because descendants lack rights to that place. And these kinds of unique religious and cultural claims are often made by indigenous peoples. So for example, the Taos Pueblo was unable for many years to perform central acts of religious observance because they because the United States government had ownership rights over Blue Lake, the holy place that was essential to their religion. Or we might imagine the Sami people in Scandinavia who herd reindeer, which is a cultural practice that seems to require a specific ecological environment. So in these kinds of cases, I think displaced descendants may have a greater claim to be restored to occupancy of their ancestral lands. But these greater claims, though, I think would really require showing that descendants cannot lead flourishing lives without residence on or control over that particular place. So which territory a person has right to occupy depends on objective facts about his interests and actual life experiences, and not on his desires and aspirations. So I want to conclude by briefly sketching how my account might apply to the second and third generation Palestinian refugees. I think that Israel does have an ongoing special responsibility to these descendants, but I also think that it may have significant discretion over how it discharges this responsibility. So in my view, Israel is responsible for ensuring that Palestinians have access to an adequate territory of residence, one where their basic rights are protected, they can engage in the cultural, social, and economic practices that matter to them, and exercise political self-determination. But there are various ways that this might be done. So Palestinians might return to parts of Israel and be granted a degree of political autonomy there. They might be settled in a future Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip with compensation for their long exile. Or Israel might aid them in acquiring a territory where they could enjoy political and cultural autonomy in some other part of the world. So I do believe it's important for third-generation Palestinians to sustain their culture and their national identity, and I agree that this requires that they possess a territory, but I don't think it has to be the exact territory of their ancestors. Thanks.
Be keeping the queue, and a reminder that you need to hold down that button on the black microphone, and if in order to speak like some of us, you need to be using both hands, you can have your partner press the button as well. And so let's start left and we'll move over.
I happen to live in Miami. I have a lot of friends who come from very flourishing cultural and economic circumstances. They've never even been to Cuba, and yet the ability to return isn't realistic until the third or maybe fourth generation in the case of that expulsion. And I guess what I'm asking is, if the right to return expires, doesn't that mean the right to expel doesn't go through an ethical lens? I mean, in other words, Castro wins, right, if they don't have the right to return?
Well, I mean, I guess I just disagree. So I think that there's a lot of grounds on which we can critique Castro, and I'm also not suggesting that the Cuban exiles have no claims against Cuba. So, for example, those people who were expropriated, had their private property taken, I think they have continuing claims for compensation. But in cases where those descendants have built flourishing lives in Miami and are incorporated into the community in Miami, I don't think that there's a moral wrong done to them if Cuba decided to say, no, we're not going to grant you, preferred return rights. Or we're not going to design, our immigration policy in order to give you a right to come home. I don't think that they would have a moral complaint. They might strongly want to go to Cuba. It would be certainly an acceptable policy for Cuba to, grant them priority, but I don't think it's morally required.
So I was wondering what the case of high-rise housing projects might mean for your argument. So here's a case where the state has given you your territory in a particular spot, and it ends up having the unintended consequences of cutting you off from resources, from networks of power, even while you're able to build community where you live. So the effects is to reproduce a messed up social structure. And so would it be wrong for the state then to tear down the housing projects and relocate people in that kind of circumstance?
Okay, so sorry, I'm just trying to understand the question. So the idea is there is a high-rise housing project which might have been a suboptimal place to live at the beginning, but now we've kind of established a community around it, and the state wants to tear it down. Is that the, okay. So people have often raised the issue of gentrification with me, which raises some similar kinds of concerns. So I don't think that, I don't think an occupancy right is necessarily violated by me being required to move from my home, because I think me being required to move from my home doesn't necessarily break all my ties to my friends, my workplace, my church, the other things that I can be involved in. So if the state condemns, say, my house and makes me move, 2 streets over, I don't conceive of that as a violation of my occupancy right, because I can still engage in all the cultural and social practices that matter to me. But I do think that there are some cases of major large-scale kinds of projects, demolition projects, dam projects, other kinds of things that really wipe out an entire community and that force people to move in ways that are highly disruptive to their plans. And there, I think that there is, there is some kind of claim against that. I think at the very least we could say, in cases where there's some really compelling reason for tearing down the high-rise, maybe it's structurally unsound or something, there's at least a responsibility on the part of the state to compensate these people because it is infringing their rights, and to facilitate their moving in a way that's least disturbing to their kind of social, cultural, and economic ties.
Yeah, so I'm interested in how much, what else we have to include within the pre-institutional or pre-political theory. So you have a very strong place for occupancy in that theory, but I wonder how much about forms of flourishing we have to include. So when you talk, for example, about Miami, you're talking about communities that can easily coexist. Maybe not easily, but they can conceptually coexist because their form of flourishing is such that there's nothing incompatible with certain businesses and certain lives living next to each other. But let's imagine a stylized conception of what happened in the American story were something like this. You had Native Americans who had a form of flourishing that was just not compatible with the form of flourishing for the Europeans as they moved in. So if you are a nomadic culture and you require huge swaths of land and you don't expect to be growing in your population, but you need to maintain those lands, and you set that next to a culture that expects to grow in its population and grow, then what's in conflict there, of course, manifests itself as property, the conflict over property, but it's really a conflict over just what is the proper form of flourishing. And I wonder whether your theory needs to be able to speak to that pre-politically. And if it does, I know you bracketed a bunch of this that you didn't think you had an answer to, but I wonder whether there's something to say about it.
Yeah, so that's a good question, I think. So I want to say one kind of abstract and general thing, and then I want to say something about the Native American example. So one way you might express this concern is in my equitable distribution constraint. I said at the very minimum it's going to require that everyone have adequate territory for flourishing. And you might think that what counts as adequate is relative to the goals and ways of life to which you're committed, such that there's just no way of adjudicating between these perspectives. I think that's the spirit of your question. So I agree that this is an important issue that I have to think harder about. But I guess I don't think that there's no way of adjudicating between these conflicting perspectives. So I think that I think that it's possible to identify a set of basic needs such that if people are in seriously dire and urgent straits, that we can recognize that cross-culturally, and that we may have to sort of change our way of life or accommodate, transform our practices in certain respects in order to allow other people to fulfill at least those basic urgent claims. And that might mean it's possible that it might mean that Native Americans, under some kinds of population conditions, cannot live a certain sort of lifestyle if it's not compatible with everyone enjoying sufficient geographical space. That's a possibility. That's a theoretical possibility, anyway. In the actual history, though, I don't think that possibility was realized. I taught a class on historic injustice where I did a lot of U.S. Indian history, and I had 2 indigenous kids in my class. And when you read through the history, there were a lot of possible cases, I think, where it would have been feasible of the U.S. To allow Native Americans not to subsist totally unscathed, but to continue practicing their way of life without the kind of heavy-handed interventionism that we performed. So, for example, it would have been possible to leave large areas of the Great Plains to them for a long time, I think, to allow them to transform their practices more slowly, not forcing them to settle on reservations. So I agree that although there's this theoretical possibility that ways of life can collide in this way, I also think that one can kind of race to that conclusion too quickly and without exploring various accommodations that I think in actual practice would have been feasible.
I think most of us in this room would definitely agree that the kind of coercive resettlements we see in war or colonialism are a bad thing. And then the question is, what do you do about it? And I found your exploration of remedies really enlightening. What struck me as more controversial and unclear is this notion of uncoerced removal.
Yeah.
But it's related to Larry's question. We could put it this way: if you think about what's been the greatest destroyer of stable, located life plans in the modern era, it's what we usually call economic progress. Mm-hmm. So 150 years ago, 90% of Americans live on farms. Now it's 2%. And the localists on the right and the left have lamented, over the last century, the kind of destruction of ways of life. And I guess the question is how, and there's a debate in political theory as well. There's sort of cosmopolitans that say as long as it's voluntary and people are getting rich, we don't care about the destruction of ways of life, versus people who would like to, again, on both the right and left, that say maybe we might want to constrain or redistribute economic modes of production and wealth in ways that you can actually keep stability at maybe greater cost. How do you keep this from becoming a trump card for having stable located life plans? And where do you draw the line? Because it seems like there's an enormous spectrum here of when you get to say, I really like being a dairy farmer, and the communities that are propped up by this, do I have a right to the subsidies that make that lifestyle sustainable? How do we adjudicate those claims? It's not as big as the flourishing of buffalo hunters versus Westerners, but dairy farmers versus tech entrepreneurs. Who wins in the lifestyle that they like?
Right. So that's a good question. So I do think that my account has some implications for economic restructuring. I don't think that we have a right against the state to the maintenance of each and every goal and commitment that we currently have. The right to the maintenance of our occupation if that becomes economically uncompetitive. But I do think that we may have a right against the state not to be required to move in order to make at least a minimally decent living. For example, you might think of a community like Detroit, where economic restructuring has led to sort of serious social decline. In cases where there are no job opportunities available to people who live there that might allow them to make a decent living, I think they may have a right against the state to economic redevelopment programs or other kinds of job initiatives, such that they have some option of staying where they are and having a job, and are not effectively forced to move in order to subsist. Now, if they have a reasonable option of making a decent living, and they choose to move to California to get a tech job because it will pay them $500,000 a year, then I don't think there's any problem with that. And so lots of people might move around. But but the thing is, they're not going to be required against their will to leave if they want to stay. And I do think that there may be a kind of right to stay and to have decent economic options, and that the state may have a responsibility to provide kind of investment programs to facilitate that. That's kind of an off-the-cuff thing, but certainly people have asked me that kind of question.
Hi, so I'm interested in the relationship between private ownership rights and your occupancy rights, and I'm thinking of two situations. One in which we grant, let's say, the first or the second generation a right of return, but all of the property is privately owned and there's no rental property available. So what kind of embodiment does this occupancy right have? And the second case that I'm thinking of is, let's say the Roma or travelers in Europe. Let's say in the utopian view of what is happening, there's free movement within Europe. Do these people then have occupancy rights all over? Or if they don't own property, if they don't have a right to live anywhere specifically?
So I think you can violate private property rights without violating occupancy rights and vice versa. So, for example, you might imagine like a nomadic community that just doesn't recognize private property rights in any kind of landed real property, and that was expelled from their territory and took their movable goods with them. So in that sort of a case, no private property rights would have been violated, but their occupancy rights would have been violated. So I do think these rights can come apart. But I agree with you that we can imagine a kind of case where, people return and they just didn't have anywhere to live or something. And I think that would be problematic, but I'm not sure that means we need to grant them private property rights. It might just mean that we need to, ensure the provision of rental housing or some other. So I agree that there might be knock-on, further downstream duties that come along with the duty to facilitate victims' return. And some of those duties might include allowing them to live a decent life once they get there. And that might mean making sure there's adequate housing, et cetera. But I don't know that it means that we have to redistribute private property. We might. I mean, you could give me maybe an argument to that effect, but I'm not sure that I see the argument directly there. The Roma is a good and complex case. So I actually find the Roma to be one of the most difficult case for me. So I find sometimes people ask me about nomads, and I think that I can account for nomads as long as they kind of have a territory within which they move around, because they still have a distinctive place that they call their own. The Roma, though, their life is about not having a place. So I'm not totally sure what to say about the Roma. Here's one thing I might say, but I'm not, I need to think more about this. One thing you might say is that that other states are under some kind of duty to facilitate the Roma having a place to go. And that's in part because the nature of the life plans that are fundamental to being a member of the Roma community is about moving around. Now, one would need to balance that kind of duty with other people's claims in the territory. But one might think that insofar as some space could be given to the Roma to camp on, for example, consistently with other people's claims, that maybe states have at least a prima facie duty to allow them to do that.
So Anna, you very studiously avoided grounding this in anything like citizenship, and in fact, you only use the term very sparingly and kind of as an aside. And I think this comes from your desire to ground this in something pre-political.
Yeah.
Maybe that's right. But I actually think you can get very, very far if you understand this as simply what it is that we owe our co-citizens. And of course, you understand as well as anyone, this idea of pre-political is an idea rather than an actual historical moment. If we find ourselves in a situation where we don't have a real politics, then we have one big duty, which is to have a real politics, right? So what we owe each other is mutual citizenship if we're bumping up against each other. And I think the advantage of understanding that you obviously have a right to not be expelled because, not just for coercion reasons, but because there it is, you're a co-citizen. You want to be treated as a co-citizen. and how could your other co-citizens do this to you? And so much of what you want, I think, you get to from a very uncontroversial idea, which is that everyone on the planet is entitled to be a first-class citizen in a legitimate, just regime. And the problem is that lots of people don't have such first-class citizenships. I wonder what's left out of this account once you make all the other concessions, which is, of course, it's not a right to your house, and it's not a right to your. You're also quite careful to say that even though many of your examples are ones of communal life, your Miami example shows that you're not grounding it in some kind of communal claim, but it's simply what each person needs. So I wonder what's left out if you run this thing as the right to be somewhere simply is incidental to the right to be a citizen.
So, I mean, this is a good question to pose to me, in part because it's coming from a kind of general view of legitimate politics that I have a lot of sympathy for. It's broadly kind of a Kantian view. But I have come to have some worries about that view. I'm not...
Don't say that around here.
I don't want to abandon it fully, but I think that it may have some problems that need to be thought more carefully about. So here are two kinds of cases that worry me about that kind of broadly Kantian view. So one kind of case is a non-state people sort of case. So, at least in earlier times in history, there were many kinds of groups that didn't have state-like institutions. And one might wonder that in the absence of those institutions, what kinds of rights over their land and what kinds of rights vis-a-vis other states and other foreign groups do they have? Do they have any at all? Or would such rights only emerge from developed citizenship practices that they didn't have? And I think we need some kind of account of the rights that that non-state peoples might have vis-a-vis foreign states and foreign individuals. The other kind of worry I have about that view is without more, I don't think it tells a story. I think it faces an objection that I call the annexation objection, which goes as follows. Let's imagine that a great, just, and legitimate state, the best one we can think of right now, maybe Sweden. Let's imagine that it just moves its border, right? And it just, re-annexes Norway, right? And then it rules Norway. I mean, it's great. They get access to the health system. They get voting rights. But the Norwegians, they didn't want to be annexed. But they are ruled in a just and legitimate way. And they are granted full citizenship rights as Swedes. Do they have any complaint? It seems to me that they do, and it seems to me we need to capture that complaint and that the citizenship story, the Kantian citizenship story, without more doesn't allow us to capture it.
So I think I have an objection that's a very close relative of that preceding question, which is just instead of citizenship, what about grounding everything in autonomy? And I think it's kind of a variant on the coercion objection, but it's not quite the same thing because it doesn't have to be that somebody forcibly imposes their will upon you. It can just be that somebody prevents you from exercising your will in some direct or indirect way. And I think this even applies to your example of the Palestinians who moved out and then couldn't move back, right? Where it seems like all of these, what all of these cases have in common is just that people weren't allowed to do the things that they would normally want to do, and including having connections and all cultural, religious practices with the place that they're currently in. So I just wonder if there's anything that account doesn't capture.
I guess, I need to know more about that account really, I think, to kind of fully evaluate it. But the worry I have with, as sort of simply stated there is, I guess I have two worries. So one is, it's not always wrong not to allow people to do what they want to do, right? So I might want to drive, 90 miles an hour around Harvard Square, but I'm not allowed to, and that's not a violation of any fundamental moral claim right that I have. So I think we need to draw a distinction between sort of quite important or fundamental interests that people ought to be allowed discretion over, and other kinds of interests such that, you know, coercing people to obey the law in an ordinary sense is not necessarily morally problematic. So perhaps there's a way that you could sort of, you know, flesh out that account that would, you know, give me an answer to that, but that would be a worry. The second worry I have is, you know, I don't know what you mean by autonomy exactly, but sometimes people attach high-flown meanings to autonomy, such that, you know, grounding rights and autonomy is really about facilitating critical reflection on your ethical commitments. And so to live an autonomous life is to live a life of self-examined life, such that one's goals and one's conception of the good are ones that have been reflected on and reflectively endorsed by the individual. And I don't think in order to have rights to territory, we need to be so demanding. I mean, I think that you can have rights to territory just because it's important to your well-being, even if you're not particularly critical, even if you're not particularly reflective, even if you don't lead a high-flown, autonomous life. So you might just be, you know, a Navajo herdsman who's kind of doing what your dad did. I think you still have a right to live where you do, even though you may fall short of the ideal of autonomy that might inform, you know, a kind of more robust, comprehensive, liberal kind of account. So those are my two worries. There may be a revised notion of the view that could accommodate those two worries, but we'd have to talk longer, I think, to flesh that out.
So one aspect of the difference between why the, say, Eastern European Jews are able to have a kind of flourishing located life plan in the US, whereas Palestinians can't in Lebanon or in Jordan, are the actions of third parties. So the US state in granting full citizenship to Jews, and then the Lebanese state in the decision to kind of confine Palestinians to the refugee camps without citizenship. So to what extent does your theory need to be expanded to include the actions of third parties, and in particular their potential to exploit some of its criteria to kind of perhaps unfairly shift blame on the kind of the settler state?
So I don't think of responsibility as kind of like a fixed pie, such that if Israel was responsible, that means Lebanon's off the hook. I think both Israel and Lebanon could be responsible for the situation of Palestinian refugees, and that the Palestinian refugees may have claims against both parties. But I guess what I would say is that the fact that Lebanon isn't doing what it should do does not exculpate Israel from a responsibility to respond to the suffering of the Palestinians.
Except if the type of response is dependent on the condition of their life right now, right? So you're saying that whether or not it can be tied to a claim to a particular place, perhaps, is dependent on the nature of the current people's life right now, but what if that's solely or 90% determined by the Lebanese state?
So I agree, but I'm not willing to accept that this is a fatal flaw. So a similar kind of, an analogous case might be a case of refugees. So often refugees are kind of created by oppressive governments, right, who mistreat people or kick them out, right? So a receiving country might say, well, it's really the responsibility of the home country to not oppress these people, and if they did their due diligence, we wouldn't have to accept them, right? But I don't think that's a sufficient response. So it is the responsibility of the home country and not to do what it's doing. But given that the home country is failing, we may have a second-order responsibility to take these people in. And so I agree that, you know, if Lebanon had treated the Palestinians differently and if they had been integrated into society, it might have been nice for Israel. Maybe Israel wouldn't have continuing claims to deal with. But given that Lebanon is failing to do that, and given that Israel created the situation in the first instance, I think it does bear this special responsibility. So I think we can say both that Lebanon is doing wrong and that Israel bears this special responsibility.
I have to be sensitive to time and thank Professor Stilz
Oh.
for this